Thank you all for showing up. What a great crowd here. All right, so we're going to talk about exposure whack-a-mole. Let's start by turning on the clicker. All right, so let's make a bold statement first. You'll never have zero risk. Risk is inherent to any infrastructure. Vulnerabilities are constantly identified, new vulnerabilities are detected, threat actors are acting to really target the vulnerabilities in your infrastructure. So you'll never have zero risk in the organization, ever. Now, some of the facts that we want to really look at are 40,000 new vulnerabilities were detected in the just last 1 year. Now, that is a 39% year-over-year increase. That is significant, 39%. Now, add to the fact that 70% reduction in time to exploit really makes it challenging for most of the organizations to not just detect the risk, but actually remediate that in the time before these vulnerabilities are exploited. As a result, what's happening is 56% of the breaches today out there are really caused because of a lack of coordinated response in fixing these vulnerabilities. So let's understand why this is really happening. Right? If you really think about it, the attack surface is expanding pretty significantly. Gone are the days when infrastructure was all that was needed to be secured and patched. Right? Now comes with digital transformation. Everything is moving to the cloud. You've got new digital asset types that need to be monitored, managed, secured. These can be anywhere from your workloads, APIs, identities, endpoints, what have you, right? And as security industry has sort of matured, we have created specialized security solutions to secure every single asset type. These specialized security solutions really create a challenge for most of our customers. They have got dozens of these cybersecurity solutions deployed in their infrastructure, which creates the alphabet soup that you see on the right side. It becomes really challenging for customers to holistically and map the attack surface in a more unified way. Another observation that we see while working with hundreds of our customers is the fact that the role of a vulnerability management team is also evolving very rapidly. Again, gone are the days when vulnerability management teams were only focused at scanning and patching. Now, they are actually stepping into the center stage and aggregating the risk telemetry from diverse tool sets, the alphabet soup that we discussed earlier, and really bringing it all together, aggregating it, enriching it, centralizing it, prioritizing these risks, and then handing it off to the rightful owners of these assets for remediation purposes. This is a new role, and the role of vulnerability management team is constantly evolving. If you really think about it, under the CISO's team, the vulnerability management teams are the ones that are focused mostly on proactive security. Most of the other organizations or other teams are focused on reactive security, meaning the SOC, post-attack threat detection, incident response. The vulnerability management teams are really focused on preemptive security, essentially cyber hygiene. So let's take a look at what happens today in the industry. There are dozens of these dashboards. As we saw earlier, multiple tools are deployed to manage the security posture across the entire digital attack surface. These really create a sprawl of tools that is hard to manage. Dozens of dashboards are supposed to be navigated. Now, if you really want to find out what is the exposure for an organization, data from these dashboards need to be interpreted, sometimes exported out into Excel sheets, CSV files, aggregated, compiled, stitched together, remotely on, offline, to produce any kind of reports that are essentially needed. This is where multiple different tools are generating a lot of risk telemetry. Now, hundreds of these risks are being identified and detected by these tools. But add to the fact that there are dozens of these tools already deployed in the organization. So now you have not just a tool sprawl, but an explosion of findings that are hard to manage. Each one of these tools also identifies what is important, the important findings or vulnerabilities or misconfigurations that they have identified. Now, while those are important, it is even more essential and critical to find out how these findings are actually correlated. How do they correlate with each other? Take an example, right? A vulnerability in a code that could potentially be deployed in a container. That container could be spun up from a container image. It could be deployed on a virtual machine. Maybe an identity has access to that virtual machine, right? This simple scenario, which plays in, day out in any organization, we just touched upon 5 to 6 different asset types. Potentially, each one of them is secured by a different cybersecurity tool. Now, how do you really stitch all of this risk telemetry together to create a cohesive understanding of the real exposure? So understanding what is important from individual tool is not just important, it is actually the collection of all of these risk telemetry to understand the true indicator of exposure. This is what a risk operations center really needs to provide. Now, the concept of a risk operations center is not a single vendor strategy. As much as all the vendors would like to use the customers to use the solutions that they have to offer, the idea here is unified orchestration. Can we really aggregate the findings from these diverse tool sets and make them work in unison so that you have a coordinated response to these risk signals? That's what the concept of a risk operations center is. Now, aggregation of findings, we have heard this somewhere else, right? Oftentimes it is referred to from a SOC perspective, where we are aggregating the threat data, essentially the events, the logs that have already happened in the past in the organization, right? The threat data is aggregated in a SOC for the purposes of correlation, understanding the root cause of an attack, so that you can create a well-formulated incident response to these threats. These are, again, post-attack threat detection, incident response processes, which are extremely essential in any organization. But think of what happens on the pre-attack side, right? Preemptive defense. The data is oftentimes fragmented. And as you see, individual tools will highlight what is important from their perspective, but holistically, it's never stitched together. This is what we are about to change with the concept of a risk operations center. Bringing all of that telemetry together, stitching all of the data points together so that we can understand the true indicators of exposure, not just findings that are scattered across multiple tools. Now, risk operations center is really a concept that really allows you to have a proper process defined and built out to build out a cyber hygiene in the organization. It all starts with asset inventory. Without an asset inventory, it's extremely hard to build any sort of cybersecurity program. And that asset inventory needs to cover every single asset type that the organization owns, not just the host-based assets or web applications or your cloud infrastructure, but it could be anything. It can be an identity, it can be SBOM, it could be an API endpoint or anything. The idea is, how can you collectively bring all of this data set together and create that foundation? Overlay the risk factors, enrich it with threat intelligence, overlay the business context to understand what are the crown jewels in the organization, and really take it through the prioritization engine to identify the right set of risk that needs to be remediated to reduce the risk across the entire organization. Finally, translating that into action through risk responses and generating reports for executive and board level communications. One thing to observe here, this risk operations center, the entire concept that we talked about, really starts from detection all the way through response. But the earlier part, the detection, oftentimes happens at machine scale. It is really like security posture management tools pointed at a certain asset type to identify what are the different vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, policy violations that can be detected. Now, detection happens at machine scale, but the response to these findings happens at human scale. People and security teams are really focused at prioritizing, building out these operational workflows for response on a manual basis. Risk Operations Center and the introduction of agentic AI on top of it really sets to change this. The problem today in cybersecurity is remediation. 20% of the critical Patch Tuesday vulnerabilities are open in any organization. 20%, that's a huge number. Now, just think about Patch Tuesday. Patch Tuesday processes have been around for quite some time. And yet we see 20% of these findings still open. 1 in 4 of the ransomware attack actually start with exploiting a known vulnerability. What it means is, patching is, or response to these findings is not happening at the pace that we all expect. In fact, 5 days is what is all required to actually exploit an asset that is externally facing. Now, compare that to the MTTR for the external facing assets in real life, right? So healthcare industry has an MTTR of 64 days, and it only takes 5 days to exploit. Hospitality takes over 100 days to really patch or respond to these findings. Now, this really creates a tremendous gap. Again, remember, detection happens at machine scale, remediation is happening at human speed. And today, Qualys is going to unveils an agentic AI solution to really power this industry's first risk operations center. This is a big leap forward because what we are really doing is providing response to these findings at the pace at which they are detected. With this announcement, what we are really doing is introducing a concept of a marketplace of cyber risk agents. These cyber risk agents are essentially your skilled digital workforce that can autonomously drive risk management programs at scale. These digital cyber risk agents augment the current cybersecurity teams to really provide an autonomous way of managing the cybersecurity risks. Now, there are built-in cyber risk agents that are offered as part of enterprise true risk management platforms. But it's not just that. We also take it one step further by allowing our customers to build their own cyber risk agents. Building your own agents that are tailored for the use cases that are most important to our customers, and being able to publish this for others to consume as well. This really creates an ecosystem of agents that can be leveraged across the industry. What is really happening is by introduction of these agentic AI on top of weave right into the Qualys' platform, we are really introducing a concept of autonomous risk management. Now, there is only one way to eat an elephant, which is one bite at a time. So the idea is really to take these cyber risk agents and employ them to really reduce the risk more effectively and in a completely autonomous way at machine speed. This really leads to reducing the MTTRs from whatever days those were, down to something that is really more manageable. All right, so with that background, let's dive right into the demo. As customers sign up for the trial version of an enterprise true risk management, an external attack surface scan, a discovery scan, is automatically triggered, which quickly identifies the different business units, subsidiaries that the organization has. This is all gathered from the public information that is available out there. And we are able to then create the business entities using this data set. So all the subsidiaries that are publicly found are sort of packaged into these buckets. Now, the next step is populating these buckets with asset information. How do you bring in that information? For bringing that information about your assets, we start configuring the connectors. Obviously, as you would naturally expect, all the Qualys modules are natively integrated. That brings the Qualys detected telemetry into the platform. However, we also have third-party connectors available, dozens of them. Wiz, setting up a connector is fairly easy. Point it to the API, provide your credentials, and that's all there is to it. As the data starts flowing into the platform, the first thing that happens is it gets deduplicated, enriched with the threat intelligence feed and business context to create the insights. Now, building out the comprehensive inventory really requires us to deduplicate the data from multiple different tools, enrich that information with business context and threat intelligence, prioritize the right set of findings, and generate the insights for the dashboard and communication purposes. As you would see here, once you have set up the aggregation framework, you have total number of assets already identified. And it's not just that, we also have a deeper dive into each one of those assets to understand what class do they belong to. Are these my infrastructure assets? Are these my cloud containers or other resources I have, network assets, storage assets? A deeper dive and breakdown of all of these findings or asset inventory is available within the platform. Now, asset inventory is the foundation of risk management programs. You also need to understand what are the findings associated with these assets. As you see here, 62 million findings were fed to the platform. Now, what do you do with these findings? Those findings are enriched with threat intelligence. Now, Qualys in the backend subscribes to over 25 plus threat intelligence feeds. We stitch that data all together, and we further curate that with our own homegrown vulnerability research. We have got 120 plus engineers working on vulnerability research. All of that data really is used to enrich the findings for effective prioritization. Let's dive a little deeper into it. As you see here, 62 million findings came into the platform, but of which, upon enriching that information with threat intelligence, we were able to reduce it down by 96%. So only 4% of the findings were actually critical when you applied a layer of threat intelligence on top of it. Let's look at it a little further. Prioritization. Now, how do you prioritize which vulnerabilities should your teams be focused on remediating, right? Typically, if you use CVSS as the framework for prioritizing, you would have prioritized 34 million, meaning your teams would have had to remediate 50% of the incoming vulnerabilities. That's a pretty daunting task. But if you use QDS, which is the Qualys detection score, which is really used based on the threat intelligence feed that we were talking about, we were able to reduce it by 92%. 92%, a significant number, right? So that really, what it does is, the findings that were identified high and critical by CVSS were actually reduced down to low or medium by QDS scores. Furthermore, on the right side, you will see CVSS prioritization also missed out and overlooked certain findings and marked them as low or medium. However, based on the threat intelligence, we have identified that some of these findings, though they were low or medium, really had an exploit out there. Some threat actors might have been active in that particular industry, exploiting those vulnerabilities. Based on that data set, we were able to prioritize these vulnerabilities and not just overlook them. So 1.7% of such vulnerabilities that were identified as low or not critical by CVSS are indeed critical. It's really important to focus on the right set of prioritization based on to the threat intelligence feeds. Now, this also creates a trail of evidence, because for compliance programs, you oftentimes need to provide the evidence why you are indeed addressing certain vulnerabilities or why you may not be addressing some, right? For example, if there is a critical vulnerability, but because of QDS deprioritization, we have lowered the severity of it to, let's say, low. Your teams may have a longer SLA, but such evidence also provides you with the ability to submit this for compliance reasons as well, so that your teams and the security posture always remain compliant to the regulatory standards. Let's move a little further down the road. As you see now, we brought in all the findings, we created the inventory, we aggregated all the findings to finally prioritize them based on the threat intelligence feeds. Now these assets are also mapped to business entities. The columns that you see here are the business entities. What is missing here is the contextual data in terms of which of these business entities is a crown jewel for my organization. Simply based on the risk data for these business entities, anyone would make a judgment that I should be focused at lowering the risk on the far right column, 950, because that happens to be the highest risk score in my organization, right? But now if you overlay some of the contextual data in terms of which one of these business entities is really critical for my organization, you might actually derive a completely different outcome. Let's go ahead and add that context here. Business context can consist of various different data sets. It could be value at risk. What am I supposed to lose if a certain business entity is targeted, is breached, is attacked? What is the loss magnitude that my organization might have to deal with? And what is my risk appetite for each one of that business entity? That would actually determine what are the crown jewels and where should I focus my limited cybersecurity resources. Let's add a business value. Now, you can actually specify what is the value at risk, fine-tune the risk appetite or the risk tolerance level for that particular business unit. If this were a crown jewel, you would actually reduce the true risk score. Once you apply this intelligence, now you can very quickly see that making a judgment call on lowering the risk on the rightmost may not be such a good idea, right? That while the risk was higher, it may have been for a business entity that may not be most impactful for my organization. The first one here, the first column that you see, has the highest value at risk, and my resources might be better pointed at lowering that risk in the organization. So let's dive a little deeper there. All right, so as you quickly saw there, 75% of the findings in that particular business entity were still open, and that was triggering the higher risk score on that business entity. Why was that the case? It was really due to the fact that the incoming pace of the vulnerabilities was much higher than the remediation pace of my organization, right? What it meant was the detection engines were identifying the risk at a much, much faster pace than the manual remediation processes that are typically deployed in an organization. As you can see, the gap between the orange line and the green line really identifies what are the open vulnerabilities currently in my infrastructure. There can be an acceptable survival rate, which could be a couple percentage, 10%, 15%, whatever the organization decides. But anything greater than that really triggers more exposure, which really needs to be addressed. Because of this higher exposure and the mismatch of the pace of detection versus the pace of remediation, we see a higher MTTR, 56 days of MTTR. Let's see what it really means. Let's map it down. This is a really great representation of MTTR. What this chart is really telling you is that 50% of the vulnerabilities require 56 days for remediation, 50%, right? Also, if you look at the slope of this curve, on the x-axis, you will see the number of days. For the first 20 days, there was barely any movement, meaning not many vulnerabilities were remediated. It could be because of multiple different facts, right? Maybe the asset owners were not identified. Maybe we don't know whether the patch is available or not. Whatever the reasons be, the goal here should be, how can I make this curve steeper and skew it towards the left, so that I am able to reduce the MTTR down to a few days as opposed to 56 days. Let's keep moving a little faster here. So let's start prioritizing effectively. Now, how do you prioritize? Prioritization really requires you to apply two sets of filters. The first one, we talked about it earlier, threat intelligence, and the second one is the business context. Now that we have added enough business context into the platform for us to identify what are the crown jewels, now let's apply that to all the incoming threat data that we see. Furthermore, having observed hundreds of our customers, how they respond to vulnerabilities and exposures in their environment, we were able to observe a pattern. And that pattern was sort of packaged into these prioritization templates that we like to call. These prioritization templates allow our customers to very quickly pick one of them and see how, what vulnerabilities might be most important for their organization. Let's pick one of the prioritization templates and apply it to the incoming vulnerabilities. As you see here, threat intelligence was quickly able to bring the number of findings down by 96%. Furthermore, when we applied the business context on top of it, we were able to reduce the number of findings by 98%. What it means is only 2% of the findings were really necessary for my team to chase after. So now, while automating the rest, they could actually put their manual efforts in targeting the 2% vulnerabilities that matter the most. Building out the response layer is extremely important, because no matter how great the prioritization engine is a risk until something is done about it, right? And doing something about it really requires a variety of options at hand. Some of them could be patching. If a patch is not available, can I create a compensating control, a mitigation to really avoid that vulnerability from being exploited? Is it possible for me to simply say, I want to accept this risk, or I want to defer that risk, or even I want to transfer that risk to a cyber insurance vendor? There can be multiple different options that are available to respond to such risk signals. These are all packaged as part of the offering as well. To build out a comprehensive risk operations center, you have the ability now not just to bring the data, build the inventory, but also understand what are the options that are available for me. It can be remediation, the mitigation, isolating an asset, or uninstalling a software, right? Just think about it this way. A server which has a vulnerability on a Chrome browser. my first goal should not be to patch the Chrome browser. It should be, do I even need a Chrome browser on my server, right? Can I just go ahead and uninstall that browser? Finally, last but not the least, is reporting. Now that you have actually prioritized the right set of vulnerabilities and put them into action in form of remediation, what is the residual risk, and can I communicate this risk across the entire organization, right? Multiple different dashboards are automatically produced by the Risk Operations Center for effective communication at multiple layers in the organization, from executives, board level, to operational insights. If you remember, we talked about machine speed detections and human speed remediations. Qualys has now introduced an agentic AI solution to really address this at the core. We want to meet the remediation and bring it to the same pace as we have detections in our organizations. As we introduce the cyber risk agents, a marketplace of digital workforce to manage cyber risk in a completely autonomous way. These agents are highly skilled agents, digital workforce that are trained for specific tasks. Having observed how customers actually respond to risk signals, we packaged all of that knowledge, the intelligence, into a cyber risk agent and trained them to address certain tasks. Let's take an example here. Let's take an example of a built-in cyber risk agent, and that can be a Patch Tuesday agent. Now, Patch Tuesdays processes have been around for quite some time, and we are pretty familiar with how crazy those are, right? The typical process involves going into multiple different websites, scraping those websites to understand what vulnerabilities are part of this next Microsoft Patch Tuesday cycle, picking those vulnerabilities, copying them, and taking them over to the vulnerability management solution of your choice to understand what the true exposure is. Now, think about it in terms of how a cyber risk agent can assist you in autonomously managing this entire process. No more manual scraping the websites, copying the CVEs, bringing it to the platform, right? As soon as you come to the Risk Operations Center, an agent is already available for you. All you need to do is employ this agent and let it run autonomously. Let's employ this agent, Sarah. Sarah is well trained to handle Patch Tuesday's lifecycle. As you see here, Sarah automatically analyzes your infrastructure to understand how many assets have Patch Tuesday vulnerabilities. What is the MTTR for those vulnerabilities today? She also identifies very quickly what the MTTR looks like, and also recommends what she could do potentially to reduce those findings. As you see here, you can very quickly patch the non-critical assets. Secondly, you could also mitigate the ones that cannot be patched. There are always assets in the organization that cannot be patched. Maybe the patch isn't available, or maybe these are regulated devices on which you cannot patch. You cannot install any patches. For such assets, you could potentially deploy a mitigation control, a compensating control, and Sarah can actually do that for you. Furthermore, we talked about uninstalling a software as well. Sarah also can identify what are the unauthorized software that are deployed on these assets that you could potentially uninstall in a completely autonomous way. Now let's assign a couple of tasks so that Sarah can actually take an action in a completely autonomous way. Upon assigning these tasks, we can also define how frequently should Sarah execute these tasks. This being a Patch Tuesday cycle, let's ask to run this on a second Tuesday of every month. Now that we have assigned a task to Sarah, let's pick a couple of other options that are available and assign them as well. Now with this knowledge, Sarah can actually execute these tasks in a completely autonomous way to reduce the risk. As you see here, each task that Sarah executes brings the risk down effectively, bringing the MTTR from 56 days to 27 days. She also is able to identify that there is a residual risk even in Patch Tuesday that Sarah wasn't able to address, right? But here comes the human in the loop. while Sarah can automate quite a few things, she also is able to identify what are the vulnerabilities that you need to manually look at, and which is just 4% of those vulnerabilities. This is a tremendous enhancement in terms of really matching the remediation speed with the detection capabilities that you already have autonomously in an organization. As you see, this brings the MTTR down to 22 days. Furthermore, we are all familiar with how employees and their performance is evaluated on an annual basis, right? The performance development in any large organization. What we have done is we have created a very similar concept to understand how these agents are actually acting inside your organization and what are the outcomes that they are producing for you. Here is a great representation of how to monitor the agent's performance over a period of time. Agent Sarah has been patching quite a few vulnerabilities. As you can see, she has deployed 48,000 patches, and her success rate seems to be pretty high. She has been reducing the vulnerabilities pretty significantly. And like we discussed earlier, she is pretty effective in increasing the slope of that curve that we talked about earlier by reducing the MTTR from 56 days to just 22 days now. Now, as you'll also see, we have rating system built out for these agents. This rating system goes across customers to understand what are these agents really impactful. Think of this as a marketplace of the agents, where we are able to understand the effectiveness of these agents across customer deployments to really help customers understand and build trust with these agentic AI workflows. Now, I wanted to touch upon the next use case that we all deal with oftentimes. How many times have we dealt with a celebrity vulnerability? A new celebrity vulnerability comes up, and one of the executives forwards an email. Hey, what does our exposure to that vulnerability look like? Right? Let's see that's happening here. An executive who belongs to a retail industry finds out that there is a new threat actor active in that retail space, and they forward that email over to the cybersecurity teams. Traditionally, you would have to log into 10 different dashboards that we talked about earlier to really gather the information about the exposure. No longer is that required. With our cyber risk assistant, which is prompt driven, customers can now simply log into this single unified dashboard and ask a question in a more natural human language. Let's ask what are the active threat actors in the vertical that I belong to. The assistant is going to automatically identify the vertical and look for all the threat actors that are active. As it identifies Black Basta, Scattered Spider, Lockbit, and other threat actors that are exploiting vulnerabilities in this vertical, it gives you a comprehensive understanding of those active threat actors. Now, you can also identify, very quickly ask them, hey, show me the list of vulnerabilities that these threat actors are targeting, and do I have those vulnerabilities in my environment, right? Instead of, again, running these queries across 10 dashboards, all you need is one sentence, and the system is able to really gather this data and generate that insight for you. As you can see here, 127 assets are exposed to the vulnerabilities that have been actively exploited by these threat actors. For example, Black Basta, right? They are exploiting the CVEs that you see there, or the Scattered Spider as well. This data set really allows our customers to very quickly understand what are the vulnerabilities that could potentially be exploited by these active threat actors in the vertical that they belong to. You could very quickly identify and ask the system to provide a prioritization or a remediation plan. Just knowing the existence of these vulnerabilities and the fact that these threat actors are attacking you does not mean much, right? You really need to figure out a plan in terms of how am I going to remediate and mitigate these threats. So let's ask the system to actually generate a recommendation or a prioritization plan. The system is going to be automatically going in and prioritizing those vulnerabilities for you to say that if you really prioritize these vulnerabilities, you are going to be able to reduce the risk. Now, let's ask the system actually to understand what the prioritization plan looks like. What it gave us is a list of vulnerabilities that can be patched, the list of vulnerabilities or misconfigurations that can be fixed, as well as the list of vulnerabilities that may not have a patch, but does have a mitigation or a compensating control. This information spans across the entire attack surface, right? It's not focused at just one solution. Remember, you are really looking at the diverse set of data that is aggregated within a single platform here. Now, if you want to actually operationalize this in a completely autonomous way, you can actually ask the system to build a new custom agent that will do these tasks on a repetitive basis. Let's ask the system to build an agent. Agent Naira. Agent Naira is absolutely created based on your session log. The way you interacted with the cyber risk assistant, all of that information, the prompts are sort of captured into this agent, and the tasks are automatically created so that you can now run this agent on a periodic basis to really understand the exposure to these threat actors. As you see here, it automatically recommends the tasks that can be assigned to the agent. Let's go ahead and target this agent for a given business entity, specify the duration at which it gets triggered, maybe let's say every Monday. And the action that we can take is send out a summary email to whoever is requesting it. As this action gets created, let's assign this task to our agent Naira. As agent Naira runs these tasks, as these tasks are run, agent is going to be able to send out this as an email to the necessary recipients. What agent is really doing is looking at all the risk telemetry across diverse tool sets, identifying which of these vulnerabilities are mapped to an adversary that is impacting the retail industry, and then finding out, are there vulnerabilities that are actively being exploited by these threat actors? Furthermore, it's not just that, it also takes into account the threat intelligence data to understand, are there even exploits that are available out there in the wild that could potentially be used by these threat actors to exploit these vulnerabilities? And then proposes a plan, remediation, mitigation, isolation, uninstallation. This plan can be executed now on a weekly basis, right, to remediate the risk. It will also identify all the internet-facing assets and prioritize them ahead of everything else. There are multiple different tasks that can be assigned to such agents that are custom built. These agents, think of them as augmented digital workforce for your cybersecurity teams that are already overwhelmed. Such summary email can now be sent to the executive who was asking for what the exposure looks like. They can completely download an entire report and understand the impact of these threat actors on their industry vertical. Finally, you'll also be able to see the impact on individual business entities in action, and also monitor the progress, the remediation progress for the prioritized findings. As you can see here on the right side, as your teams are mitigating, remediating these findings, the percentage of success keeps increasing. And as you see here, 85.7% findings were already fixed. This allows you to compute and understand the arrival rate and really match the burn down rate, or increase the burn down rate, so that you are able to effectively reduce the open vulnerabilities in your infrastructure. Effectively, what is happening is you are essentially creating these tasks and autonomously driving these tasks across your entire organization to reduce the risk at machine scale. That is the real concept that we're introducing with agentic AI built on top of Qualys' platform. This is the most innovative concept that we are launching here at Black Hat, and I couldn't be more thrilled about it. This really transforms the Qualys' platform into making it really world's first AI-native risk operations center. Again, remember, how do you eat an elephant, right? One bite at a time. Employ these agents to reduce the time to response and make it machine scalable, as opposed to human responses that exist today in the industry. Build a ROC, AI-native ROC of your own. Scan the QR code, sign up for a trial. Our teams will be delighted to help you out in building your risk operations center as well. Thank you so much for coming today. I really enjoyed speaking with you. Thank you.